Katherine Berney. She joins us from Canberra now, and she's the Executive Director of the National Women's Safety Alliance in Australia. Really appreciate you joining us today, Katherine. Firstly, violence against women in Australia has been labelled a national crisis. How did it get to this point?
I think that it has been a national crisis for some time, and I think it's really important to remember that a lot of people have been advocating about these issues for 26 years or more. It's just when the attacks on Bondi happened, we saw what is in our cultural landscape in Australia, violence that's considered private or hidden was suddenly in a very public sphere, a horrific public sphere, and it's made people feel nervous, and agitated, it's engaged people into solving this as an issue.
There's been around 26 to 28 deaths from what I believe in this first part of the year. That's quite a big jump from this time last year. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the domestic violence behind some of these killings and perhaps why there's been this upshot?
I think we've had actually a 30% increase since last year, and we also have to talk about what our community attitudes are towards violence against women. So in Australia, we have an excellent report called the National Community Attitude Survey. Now, it clearly demonstrates that Australians feel that domestic violence, violence against women is an issue. However, 43% of people think it's not an issue in their community. So I think there's this idea that violence that happens in the home is other. It's not happening to people I know. It's not happening to people in our family. It's not happening in our friendship groups. But it is. It is. And the problem is that people are unclear of how they need to address that and how they need to move forward. And it's normalising this environment where we see these horrific crimes and they continue to thrive because we're not addressing the core issue that violence is in our community and it happens.
So let's just talk about some of the more high-profile cases of women being killed in Australia. From time to time, when I grew up in Australia, I would see, the front page splashed with perhaps a sporting star being accused of a sexual assault or something like that. There's been a flurry of inquiries to sporting clubs since some of these more high-profile cases have come to light. Can you just talk a little bit about Australian culture, the Australian identity, and how it's defined by sport, and perhaps how it's fueled this gender-based violence in some ways?
Look, I think that sporting codes now have an absolutely clear responsibility to address this as an issue. Just recently, we had the AFL provide a round, so the Australian Rules Football provide a round to acknowledge the women who had died this year, but in the same breath we heard the New South Wales AFL were going to elevate Wayne Carey, a player who has a history of harming women, to legend status. The two messages don't work. It needs to start at a grassroots community level because that is where we get a lot of engagement with kids and adolescents, young people in Australia. Sport's incredibly important to our national identity. So there is a real opportunity for us to ensure that we have education through those channels about respecting women and saying, actually, violence isn't okay. It's not a joke. It's not casual. It is completely unacceptable. And we need to treat everyone with that kind of respect.
And the government is now stepping up to try and say it's willing to shift these attitudes in a more structural way. What are some of these more specific things that the Albanese government are saying that they're willing to do?
So I think what we've seen since the new government was in is a real renewed interest in how we look at the frameworks of how we address violence. This includes a lot of family law reform. It includes the ALRC, the Australian Law Commission review into strengthening criminal responses to sexual violence. We have a cultural problem of violence, but we do need to ensure that our systems and policies are fit for purpose to facilitate the cultural change that we so desperately need. Now, we have seen that commitment from the government, and it's a really positive and inspiring time because we really need this change. There's nothing partisan about this issue. Every party should be absolutely committed to reducing violence against women and children.
And, as the government's pointed out, it's not just a government issue, it is a civil society issue. What things can the media, workplace, behaviours on social media do to try and help shift this problem?
I think the most important thing and the simplest thing that people can do when they are in the media and they are reading about potentially high-profile cases or they're speaking about women is to believe women's experiences. We don't have that in our cultural DNA. We still work from a framework of suspicion and women lie to hurt the lives of men. Empirically, with all the data, that is simply not the case. And so I think the problem seems so huge, but when we examine our own biases, when we examine how we think about violence and how we frame it, particularly with high profile cases, then we need to start from a position of believing people.
Yeah. All right, Katherine Berney, we'll leave it there. Really appreciate you taking the time for us today.
Thanks for having me today.